It's Sunday, October 5, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. Our guest today is a professor of political science at Brown University and author of the book The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, which just won the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award. He's also the co-host of the podcast The Oath and the Office. Corey Brettschneider, welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Corey, in your book, you reference the assaults on democracy by 5 past American presidents. How do the crimes of the 47th president compare to those from history? I mean, does Watergate pale into insignificance compared to the corruption of the Trump White House?
Well, the structure of the book, as you've already hinted at, is to talk about these past crises, to say they're way more serious than we've realized before. But also each one of them has an aspect of Donald Trump. He really is all of them at the same time. And if that seemed like hyperbole before this term started, we see now that it's really not. The crises themselves, I think, have been downplayed in American history to the extent that we even know about them or have talked about them. And part of what I'm doing in the book is looking closely at them and saying a couple of things. One is they're way worse than we realized. But it's also that we're less aware of the fragility of American democracy than we have been. UK Westminster model, for instance, parliamentary democracy, is much more flexible than the US model. It has a rigidity to it, and it has a danger in it. And the danger was recognized from the beginning of the country's founding by the anti-federalists, those who argued against ratification. So Patrick Henry, who of course is our most famous anti-federalist, a revolutionary hero who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," less known is that he said, "Do not ratify this Constitution, because if you do, it has a mechanism in it, the presidency, that assumes a good person in power." They were assuming George Washington. "What if you have a bad president?" he said. And then he said something really frighteningly prescient. He said, "What if you have a criminal president?" The system's not designed to withstand that kind of person. Impeachment's not going to work. The idea that the court is going to be a check is not real. They won't be able to indict. And so who will, as he puts it, who will stop this force? And his answer is nobody. And he predicts American democracy will collapse. Now, my hopeful story in the book is that he was partly right, that we really don't have the normal means, the supposed checks and balances that Americans learn in 7th grade don't work against such a president and haven't in the past. They're not working right now. But we do have a mechanism that does work, and that's the strength of the American people coming together to defend a democratic as opposed to an authoritarian idea of the Constitution. And they prevail in a very specific way, which is getting behind recovery presidents that put American democracy back in order. And so the argument of the book is that this structural danger has reared its head 5 previous times. Certainly it is right now again. And the traditional checks don't work, but American democracy can come through. There is hope because the American people have galvanized around a democratic idea of the Constitution and installed what I call recovery presidents that have put things back together. So as bad as it is now, I believe there will be a recovery. And part of the argument, to go to the heart of your question, is it was this bad in the past. I mean, if I just give the examples, the Sedition Act did shut down the opposition party. Dred Scott denied, with the aid of President Buchanan, all rights to Black Americans everywhere, not just enslaved people. Andrew Johnson really almost did succeed in bringing slavery back under a different name. Woodrow Wilson did nationalize white supremacy. He wasn't the first white supremacist president, but he was certainly the first white nationalist president. And you mentioned Nixon. Part of the story that we tell ourselves about Richard Nixon, which I undo in the book, is that it was all about Watergate, which is a kind of silly small crime. But those weren't the real crimes of Richard Nixon. They were much more intense, and they had to deal with the attempt to shut down his opponents, including the person I interviewed at length for the book, Daniel Ellsberg, who he was obsessed with. And so when we understand the full extent of these crises, we see how bad it was in the past, and it makes it even more impressive that we've recovered in the past. And that's why I'm hopeful at this moment.
And with Nixon as an example, invariably people get famous for the thing that they got caught for, but not necessarily for, as you say, all the corruption that was going on during. I suppose firstly, I should say it's very hopeful to hear you talk about life after Trumpism, because it does seem so all-encompassing, and people are really hurting right now. I mean, this is not just about headlines and clickbait. This is real, and it's not just immigrants that are hurting, or people that are, have deportation orders or are sitting in some kind of terrible prison in, some far-off country they've never been to before because of Trump. It's American citizens who are hurting because their republic, their democracy has been taken away. How has that kind of registered in history? I mean, is that the case, that it's the people, the American people and the citizens, who are standing up for those who don't have the same rights? Is that the storyline that we're about to see?
It's got to be a combination. It is the case that many of those whose rights are most directly affected often take the lead. But at various moments, it wouldn't be enough it's enough to spark a movement, but it's not enough for a movement to succeed. You need solidarity with other groups. And so what they've had to do is to take their own struggles and connect it to a national identity. And the identity that I argue that does work, and these are not just, admirable people who did important things. It's people who won. That's really what I care about, because I don't want to just have an admirable stand against Donald Trump. I want to win against Trumpism. And so that's what I'm really interested in the book. And so they were able to galvanize their own struggles to tie it to some universal idea that's embedded in the United States Constitution and its values. So as you see how they did it, you see what I'm talking about. And again, each of their struggles is directly relevant in a kind of frightening way. Take the first, John Adams signs the Sedition Act. By the way, we thought this was a more minor issue than it was, partly because historians thought the number of prosecutions was about 35, but we now know it's way more than that, more like 135. It included even the vice president, who believed that he might be prosecuted. And just to show you how serious a crisis this was, how much of a shutdown of democracy, the legislation, the Sedition Act, is designed to make it a crime to criticize the president of the United States, but it's not a crime to criticize the vice president. Now, why design legislation like that? It's because the vice president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, is a member of the opposition party. And so, from the beginning in its text, the Sedition Act is an attempt at ending American democracy. And the people prosecuted are prosecuted. Sometimes historians talked about them as, their speech was just way out there. No, they're saying things like that Adams that's a good slip, actually, because they have so much in common. Slip of the tongue. That Adams is a hypocrite, that he's two-faced, that he's too close to England in his foreign policy. These are things of policy. And sitting Congressman Matthew Lyons is one of the 135 who's prosecuted for his remarks on the floor of the House of Representatives. So this isn't wild language that's being shut down. It is core political speech, and it is a successful shutdown of the opposition party.
What's different now, though, is, I guess, it was Republicans that kind of forced Nixon to resign, right? But now Republicans are silent on their own leader. And so pressure to resign or pressure to change course, it's been, there aren't the checks and balances even from within Trump's own political party.
You can find analogies and disanalogies in a lot of these situations, and that is certainly true in the Nixon situation, that he isn't impeached by the full House, but the vote in the House Judiciary Committee is bipartisan. In fact, one of the Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee talks about that proceeding, the process of moving forward towards impeachment, as a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. And my podcast, The Oath in the Office, was a book with that subtitle, and it was inspired by that. And so that you're right, certainly in that Nixon case, that the resistance in the end is bipartisan. That's part of why he resigns. But that's not true in the other example. So in that Sedition Act, which I started describing it, but the way we recover, I think I captured why it was so dangerous. The way we recover is they are able to move beyond their own stories of being shut down, journalists and politicians, and to find this universal idea of that they find in the First Amendment of free speech. The right to dissent, they say, is part of the right to free speech, the right to satire, to Jimmy Kimmel, to SNL. That's what they're talking about. And that isn't established at the time. But they don't prevail upon the opposition. It's not like a coalition comes together of Adams' party, then the Federalists. In fact, the Federalist Party dies as a result of this overreach. And the Supreme Court certainly is actively participating with Adams in shutting things down. They're not the heroes. In fact, they never are the heroes. That's one of the surprising things about the book. They usually make the crises worse, despite the myth that the Supreme Court is really a check for democracy. So how do they do it? It is through partisan politics. They create what becomes the Democratic Republican Party, a loose ancestor of the Democratic Party, and prevail in the election of 1800. But when Jefferson says we're all Democrats, sorry, I flubbed that line. When Jefferson says we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, he's on the one hand gesturing towards a universal idea of coming together, but it isn't at the behest of a bipartisan coalition that he's elected. It is deeply partisan. And that's true in the other stories too. The recoveries aren't going to come necessarily from a kumbaya moment of everybody coming together. They will come through organizing and through protest and through appeal to universal language, but usually in opposition to the crisis president's party.
Was it the case in history that the president kind of assumed power to the point that he didn't feel the need to send anything to Congress? Because this is what we're seeing now, isn't it? That Trump is basically bypassing Congress for everything, from tariffs to acts of war, because he knows that he has the majority. And therefore, he assumes something, to quote him, I am the law. I am the chief law enforcement officer. So he sees himself as the authoritarian maybe. Has that ever happened before, where ignore the branches, ignore the system as it is laid out?
Yeah, and the answer is absolutely yes. With all these questions, right. There's a temptation to say it's unprecedented because it feels good. It brings out the horror, and it is. I would never underestimate that we are facing a crisis of democracy. The system can collapse, and it could have in these past moments. But it's not unprecedented in the sense that we have been here before. We've seen these kind of very serious crises that threaten the stability of democracy itself. Now, in the Sedition Act, it is true, there's legislation. But in a way, that's worse, right? That Adams is, offended by his son and personal insults, and he's able to get all three branches of government to cooperate with him in shutting down the opposition. So that's more scary. It's as if, Congress were in the open to say, let's have an anti-Jimmy Kimmel law and pass it. And the Supreme Court were to lobby for that law, which is what Samuel Chase did. So in that instance, you're right. He's not bypassing the other branches. He's cooperating with them, but that's more frightening rather than less. Take the next case that I talk about, which is the case of President Buchanan, who pretends that the question of slavery is going to leave to the Supreme Court, like you learned in civics, and they decide the law and he'll be neutral. And Frederick Douglass at the time called them out and said that that's not at all what's going on. And we know now that Douglass was absolutely right. He was lobbying the Supreme Court to decide this Dred Scott case in the most evil way possible, which is actually to use this case about an enslaved person who found himself in a free state and then was re-enslaved, and use that example. Could have been decided in all sorts of ways to say Black Americans have no rights under the Constitution. Now, not only is that bypassing Congress, which had all sorts of rights of regulation in the territories, for instance, to limit slavery, but it's shutting it down. So it's the president combining with the Supreme Court to really end on the most important issue of the day, a power of Congress. When Woodrow Wilson resegregates the federal government, what I argue in the book, I went into his into the archives in Princeton, near where I, as a graduate student, took classes and found his lecture notes. And he talks about the idea of national efficiency. That's what a president is supposed to do. Beyond Congress, beyond the court, it's the president alone that's responsible for national efficiency. Now, what's in the way of national efficiency? It's what he calls friction, which is a kind of code word that he uses in the lectures and elsewhere for integration. So he, on his own, without any official act even, brings white supremacy to spread throughout the national government through the segregation of the federal government. Now, he's called out in real time by William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells, who know to resist. They see the danger. So that is in Congress. He creates the bully pulpit, which is sort of the ultimate way of bypassing the other branches. Technically, it's Teddy Roosevelt creates the press office, but Wilson puts his students in the press office. He knows how to really use the power of persuasion in order to affect change. And part of what he's doing is spreading ideas of white supremacy and pro-nativist ideology. So, for instance, during Red Summer, some of the worst racial violence this country's ever seen, rather than quell the violence, he's giving speeches about hyphenated Americans and kind of upping the level of tension and more. None of that has to do with other branches. That's just him on his own. Or Andrew Johnson giving speeches about how his opponents in Congress, including one especially, should be violently attacked. So all of this is we've seen before, and it's especially the bypassing of the other branches. And in the example that I gave you, where he doesn't bypass it, John Adams, it's scarier. I mean, that he has that kind of control over all three branches.
Talk to me about how propaganda has been used over the years, because as an example, just a few days ago, Trump says, we're going into Portland, Oregon, because we have to quell the violence and all of the hatred and everything that goes with that. But there wasn't any violence. So, he's sending in the military, the National Guard, and the timeline was such that, whether it was a mistake or whether it was pure propaganda, it does appear that Donald Trump, who is a master marketeer, as much as we hate to put master in his name to anything, but he really is manipulating the narrative. And that is a concern, isn't it? Especially if you live in Portland and suddenly you're being told your city's under siege and you look out the window and it's perfectly peaceful. Yeah. So how is this, is there a pattern of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's classic Wilson, that a lot of what Woodrow Wilson did is really not only rewrite the current moment that he was living in to bring in what I call, again, not just white supremacist, but white nationalist ideology, but to rewrite the entire story of the 19th century. So the story of the 19th century, in the same way that I should say in the 18th century, it was the newspaper editors, journalists who fought back, using their own trials as a way of putting Adams on trial, and then galvanizing their support behind Thomas Jefferson as a recovery president. You see that story again in the story of Buchanan, and the hero of the 19th century, as I tell it, really the true hero of American democracy is Frederick Douglass, who says we need to learn to read the Constitution as a democratic document. The document doesn't say we the white people. This is his quote. It says we the people. He says it bans the corruption of blood, the idea that you can inherit crimes from parents in the next generation. What is that but an anti-slavery principle? And most of all, what he says, and this is familiar with Gettysburg, but this is way before Gettysburg, before Lincoln utters similar words. He says, you need to use the Declaration of Independence and its guarantee of equality as a frame for the whole Constitution. And the two words that he uses over and over again are equal protection. And those are words that the Congress, in the aftermath of the Buchanan presidency, partly as a result of Lincoln's efforts in the 13th Amendment, but eventually those words find their way embedded into the Constitution. The story I'm telling is this kind of push and pull, and that reality does take hold. It takes hold in the Grant administration, the recovery from Johnson, in the passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act. But what happens to that reality is that it's erased, and this is so much more, as dramatic as what you're saying about Portland is, this is even more dramatic because it's the rewriting of the entire history of democracy. And what Woodrow Wilson is a part of, and you see this in not just in his speeches, but really in his textbook, which was a way of popularizing history, including this history that I'm telling you about, is he rewrites it. He talks about the Klan as if they were, not great, but necessary in order to quell the real danger of the 19th century, which was Black Americans rising up and being elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. What a terrible thing to have happened. And it is this white supremacist narrative that he's retelling. So, again, like, not to take anything away from Trump, but he doesn't have anything on Woodrow Wilson. He's part of a group. He's not the only one. The Dunning School is part of this historians movement. But this PhD, one of the most learned people at the time, professor and then president at Princeton, he's rewriting American history in order to create this grand narrative that will bring white supremacy national in the 20th century. So Trump has done a lot with Wilson's bully pulpit, and also, like Wilson, shutting down democracy. And the use of Twitter, for instance, changes it. It's more direct. And that is an innovation, a kind of scary one, that he doesn't need to even have the press or have his students as Wilson did. He is lying to us about what's happening in real time, even though, I have friends posting in Portland about how nice it is and what are they talking about. But, I don't know. When I compare it to rewriting the entire history of American democracy from the 19th century, it seems to pale in comparison.
It sure doesn't feel that way at the moment, I suppose.
No.
And this is the problem for a lot of people. It feels absolute, and there is a certain dread, I think, of how he is weaponizing anything. I mean, even the assassination of Charlie Kirk, as tragic as that was, has really been used as a springboard for Trump to just weaponize not just the use of language but policies as well, to say that Democrats are the enemy, and using this language that not just Democrats politically but anybody who supports the Democrats. Right. And so liberal people and progressive people, but also minority groups, which he just lumps into that group as well. Yeah. Anybody that is not for Trump is an enemy of the state. And that, to me, that's what seems different. Am I wrong?
Yes, I think so. In the sense that, you're right in one sense. Again, I would never minimize how serious this threat is. But part of the point of the book, and I think when you read it, you see that, is to emphasize how frightening it felt. And American democracy, if Adams had succeeded, for instance, in his plot to steal the election of 1800, a plot that is eerily identical to the plot of January 6th, because it had to do with a committee refusing to certify electoral votes with claims of fraud, and with the hope that things would be thrown to the House of Representatives, as it would have in January 6th, voting state by state and resulting in the election of not Trump then, but Adams. Eerily similar. So think of that. If that would have succeeded, and it almost did, but for the efforts of a journalist named Duane, who uncovered this and was prosecuted under the Sedition Act, American history would have been totally different. Adams actually thought of the presidency as a kind of as a kind of monarchy, and in fact, he thought there were too many parliamentary constraints on the British king. If that view would have prevailed, so different from the way we think of American democracy now, we would have had a totally different system. And that's true too, in the Dred Scott story and Woodrow Wilson. And it could have gone that way, did for many decades in the case of Wilson go that way, so much so that the hero of that part of the book, William Monroe Trotter, who calls out what's happening in real time and really begins the civil rights movement in many ways, he kills himself thinking that white nationalism and Wilson has won. He's done everything he can. That's how dire things looked, and yet there is this recovery. So that's where my hope, and what I'm doing every week with my co-host John Fugelsang on The Oath in the Office. John is a comedian, so it's a sort of mix of serious and funny, and now I should say New York Times bestselling author. We're bringing out the horror of the current moment, but also each week trying to show the hope, the way forward, partly through history and past examples, because as dire as it is now, and we could do this with each of them, and I'm happy to keep doing it because I think it's instructive, it was that dangerous then. And again, when you compound that with the fragility of the system that Patrick Henry identified, it really could have collapsed, and yet it didn't. That's in a way the amazing thing. It's remarkable. It's not that it was inevitable. And sometimes political scientists talk in terms of mechanisms. I don't talk that way. I talk in terms of hope, because we did succeed in the past. It doesn't guarantee future success, but it's more than possible. And we have, by the way, what they didn't have. We have their legacy. We have the ideas of American democracy, the idea of dissent, the idea of equal protection, the idea never really realized after Nixon. I'm happy to talk about why that recovery was far from complete. But the idea that no person, not even a president, is above the law. Now, the book came out within a day of the immunity case. That's an insult to that idea. Yeah. So we are in a crisis, But the idea is still with us. The president is not above the law. I spoke to two of the grand jurors who, many of them voting with two hands to indict Richard Nixon, a story that isn't well known at all. But they did try to do this indictment. They were convinced by Leon Jaworski, usually seen as a hero, not a hero in my story, to not do it, to delay, and the pardon took away their possibility, despite their serious attempts to indict him from doing that. They ended that. But when I spoke to one of the grand jurors on the phone, she was like, I was amazed just talking to this person. Nobody's ever heard of either of these grand jurors, and their families knew they were involved in something important. But, the simple intuition, nobody's above the law. And the president's not any better than we are. That idea of equality, we have the legacy of these past victories, maybe without realizing it in depth in the way I'm telling the story. But that's an additional reason for hope.
The problem is that most people are not academic in the way that you are. In fact, I think the statistic is something like half of Americans read at a 5th grade level. Or might be 4th grade level. I'll have to check. But this is problematic, isn't it? When you're not well read and you're not academic and you're not educated to look to history. And we are living in a world so different to the references that you make in the book because of Truth Social and Twitter and all these various mechanisms for communicating, but within an ecosphere. So people are, the people that watch Fox News, they're not getting an alternative view of any kind.
Yeah.
Was it ever like that before? Because, this is how Trump's been able to be so successful and convince people that he is worth re-electing, is because he controls the media as much as he controls the narrative.
Absolutely. He doesn't control all of the media. He doesn't control the Oath in the Office podcast or Midas Touch and all of your brilliant shows.
That's that's the last two left.
For now.
Right, yeah.
And, that connects actually to the story of the past. I do want to say something that is surprising. I didn't expect this in writing the book, but just on the main point about your point about education. The most educated presidents, and Trump is far from that. He's easily one of the least educated, despite having a degree from, an Ivy League school. But the most educated in some ways are the most dangerous because they understand the mechanisms so well to achieve their goals. So Adams is usually regarded and lauded as one of the premier intellectuals of his time. He's got a mini series about him. Paul Giamatti plays him. My colleague and others, I think my colleague Gordon Wood interested me in a lot of conversations in the book. He loves Adams and is a defender of him, partly because of how remarkably brilliant he was for his time. I read the books. They're pretty good. They're not as brilliant as everyone says, but for a president, it's unusual scholarship. But yet, what did it lead to? It led to an idea of monarchism, an idea of confidence such that you would shut down the opposition party, joined by the most prominent and educated Supreme Court justices like Samuel Chase. And, we see that now with Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch, the only, by the way, Supreme Court justice with a PhD in American history. They are not battling against the shutdown of democracy. They are enabling it. And that's true then too. Wilson, I've mentioned at length. I mean, my gosh, that is, the one of the premier political scientists of his time. For a long time, the Wilson School at Princeton was named after him before, thankfully, the president had the good sense to see the reality that this wasn't somebody worth naming something after. And it's citizens who are in some ways mocked as uneducated. The House of Representatives and Matthew Lyons are seen as the uneducated house, the low house. And yet their common sense is so reassuring, and it doesn't come from some form. Yes, they are journalists, so they're literate, but it's not that they're high-minded intellectuals. They see something basic. Frederick Douglass, of course, an enslaved person who finds his way to freedom. And of course becomes educated, but self-educated. So, I think a lot of the story isn't about formal education or formal knowledge. It's about seeing the reality. Now, in their times too, not in Nixon, Watergate, I think, is the counterexample to what we're facing now. It is true that millions of Americans watched John Dean, who, by the way, I had the bizarre experience of just being on CNN with and talking about Watergate. And, but they watched him testify. That meant something, that the country did it as a whole. But in these past examples, in the sedition crisis, there are two realities. There's a Federalist reality and a Democratic Republican reality. And one reality, the Federalist reality, which is false, by the way, they believed that America was on the verge of an invasion from France. There were some boats and ships in the Caribbean, but there was no invasion planned. But yet they believed that. And you would read about that, all the time. If you were in the world of abolition, things were divided between Douglas and Garrison's camp on the question of the Constitution's pact with the devil or something to save us, and the world of even more difference with pro-slavery forces. We could keep going, but that's true. William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, the reality that they're talking about of lynching, for instance, in Wells' case, who was one of the people that with Trotter confronts Wilson. By the way, when they confront him about his national segregation policy, that he says, "You're creating friction." And that's his response, to use this educated language of the Constitution that he's been lecturing in the hallowed halls of Princeton. And they're like, no, you're creating a system of second-class citizenship. They're not, those aren't, at the time, certainly, they wouldn't be regarded as more educated than Wilson. In fact, he's looking down on them because they lack his formal credentials. So as a professor, you want to believe these ideas are going to save us, but it's really the opposite. It's our kind of humanity.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. It's an instinct for humanity that is ultimately what drives people who are uneducated. And I think that's something that we all share. You mention in the book, we keep coming back in the book to white supremacy, and you've mentioned it here as well. This notion that this has been a thing that has been around for, is so much a part of America's history, political and cultural. It certainly hasn't gone away. And with Donald Trump, he's not just a white supremacist, he's also a eugenicist. And he actually believes that he has, despite being orange, weirdly, that he is a superior being by nature of his genes. And he talks in these terms. Yeah. This is obviously, this is problematic. I mean, it also connects to his criticism of autism in this last week as well, claiming that these people are defective in some way. And again, this is connected to eugenics, and RFK Jr. is a eugenicist as well. In fact, so many people in Trump's cabinet speak this language too. Is this a kind of two-pronged problem, or is this all in one camp as far as you're concerned? The
parallels, it's almost like you're tossing. I was not very good at Little League, but if I was, you'd be tossing the balls for me to hit. I had one good season. It would be like that good season where the balls seem to be coming to me. The story of Wilson is frighteningly relevant because he actually studies. He has a PhD where he studied with the main defender, a professor named Baxter Adams, of something called the Teutonic germ theory. And that is the pseudo-scientific origin of what becomes, a lot of eugenic theory.
This is a Pete Hegseth thing. He says he never washes his hands because he doesn't believe in germs. Well,
this is a side note, but it really comes together because when I did my PhD at Princeton, and I taught for a professor who is celebrated by Hegseth, a conservative professor, and I'm not 100%. I'm putting it at 90% sure I was his TA. So I'm responsible, and the class, by the way, is civil liberties, so which makes it even more wild. So I know many of Hegseth's teachers, whether he's firmly in that camp or not, it is been around for a long time, and the form that it was around during the Wilson period. I mean, the idea that the president of the United States, Trump doesn't have a PhD in Teutonic germ theory, the theory of, and that's how deep Wilson's white supremacy was. I mean, in fact, it's well known about Wilson that the film Birth of a Nation, a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, the first full-length film, was shown in the White House. But what's less understood is that the reason why he was so concerned to promote it in the showing in the White House, but also in many other ways, was because his roommate at Hopkins was the author of The Klansman, the book that's the basis for that Birth of a Nation is based on. And what I argue in the book is that there are eerie parallels, at least, between many of the scenes that of the 19th century that Wilson describes in his textbook and the film. And those parallels, show you that this isn't just some thing that he did, to like the movie or something. No, his white supremacy is deeply ingrained. And in these lecture notes that I went and looked at, in addition to talking about friction, is he really undoes the idea that there was any Reconstruction at all, that the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection, and the most important of those post-war amendments, the 15th guaranteeing the right to vote, at least for men, free from discrimination, and then providing a mechanism for Congress to pass new laws shutting down the racial violence around the United States, which Grant does uses, as I tell in the book, to create the Department of Justice and prosecute more than 1,000 white terrorists. What does Wilson say about that in these notes? He's teaching constitutional law. That's the story of constitutional law. If you're really going to tell the true story, he tells it as insignificant, that they didn't really add any rights to the Constitution. And so, he is rewriting history. He's using this white nationalism, as I call it, aided by his crazy eugenics ideas that he's learned at Hopkins. That is so much more dangerous, I would say, and powerful at the time. Now, we know we recovered. He died, of course. And there was a recovery, a long, long march, as it's often called, to recover from what he had done. But at the time, the reason Trotter is so disillusioned is because he's winning not just a battle here or there, or using the presidency in a dangerous way, but he's rewriting successfully all of American culture and history. And Trump is trying to do that, don't get me wrong, but so far he hasn't succeeded. We're still here doing this show, and I'm doing the Oath in the Office every week, and Jimmy Kimmel remarkably is back. And as much as he might be, we're teetering, and I've even been using the phrase that Trump is attempting a self-coup, a coup to destroy the judiciary, to destroy Congress. That's what's going on. I don't want to say that we haven't faced anything like this before, because we have. And in some ways, our opponents in the past the people's opponents were even more dangerous.
But people, especially scholars and journalists and historians, as well as political scientists, have admitted that we are now under some form of dictatorship. And that this is an authoritarian takeover of government, as well as the deconstruction of the administrative state, as we know, baked into Project 2025, well underway.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a time in history where people have acknowledged that the dictatorship is present, and it's not just something that's off in the future? Oh, well, if it carries on like this, we could, because losing your democracy comes in, it's so intangible, it relies on people taking part. But to all intents and purposes, Trump is never leaving the White House.
That could be. And I don't want to downplay anything that you've said, because every week we're documenting that. We're talking about it. In fact, I've been using the phrase to say future historians, when they look back, I had a piece in The Guardian saying something similar, and I've been saying it every week on the Oath in the Office. They'll refer to this period, there's a very good chance, likely even, as the dictatorship, because he has succeeded in so eviscerating the other branches. And the court, although there's some moments of pushback, it's not completed, has been enabling it. And the Project 2025 use of the unitary executive theory, which I talk about every week on the podcast, created in the Meese Justice Department really in the 1980s as a way of exerting control over the president's ability to hire and fire and to destroy independent agencies. Partly it was aimed at destroying the independent counsel law that allowed for the possible prosecution of a president. And in fact, if that law was here, I think we might not have been in this moment, because that office wrote memos saying to the contrary of the DOJ, yes, a sitting president can be indicted. It was designed for the purpose of serious investigation of the president. And the prosecutor named Ken Starr, who I agree was a little overzealous, angered a Democratic president who got rid of that law. And that, of course, was Bill Clinton. So without that, and the unitary executive theory, the immunity case, the firing of independent agencies, the attempt to destroy the civil service, this is an attempted dictatorship. And yes, I think there's a good argument to be made that we've crossed over we're not just headed there, we've crossed over the boundary where it will make sense in the future to call it that. But now, have we ever seen anything like it? Yes. I mean, I'll start with Adams. Not only was there a shutdown of the opposition party, Jefferson and Madison, by the way, are writing to each other in code. And Jefferson is saying, we've really got to be careful because I could be arrested under this law. In some ways, as much as the newspaper editors criticizing Adams were the primary target, Jefferson was also a possible target because he's the leader of the opposition and the biggest risk to Adams. Adams flirts with all sorts of monarchical ideas, including Jefferson complains in one letter, the guy wants to bring back royal titles. I thought he was with us in this whole Declaration of Independence. Wasn't he part of the group? And he has a very different understanding of what the revolution was about. So now if you have a monarchist idea, you've succeeded in shutting down the opposition party. I haven't seen, Harris is still out there giving speeches. She's not writing to her friends in code saying I better not even speak out. So in that sense, it was worse. And here's what's even more worse. The ideas of democracy were never even established. And so far from there being some sort of consensus that this was a bad thing to shut down democracy, the thought was, that's good, that you want a kind of monarchy. The idea hadn't established itself yet. You had to have that crisis in order for democracy to arise in the first place, to have an idea of free speech as the right to dissent. It comes from Adams' monarchist idea. So yeah, we've seen it before. It was in some ways more dangerous because there's nothing there yet. American democracy is being created at that moment, and yet we prevail. And so that's why I think here, not understating in any way, a dictatorship, self-coup. I talked, by the way, in the beginning of the Trump administration on the Oath in the Office podcast about soft coup, the ways in which using hiring and firing, for instance, the stealing of funds from Congress, the power of the purse lies with Congress. But what Doge did and Musk did is they figured out the actual purse is in a Treasury Department closet in a computer, and they stole it. So that is a coup. That is a soft coup. Now, with the use of the military in our cities, the prosecution of Comey, now we're in the world of hard coup. This isn't just, subtle.
Well, I wanted to ask you,
but yet it happened then too.
What you thought of that kind of speech that Trump kind of made up. He didn't read it off the teleprompter in front of the military generals, where there was the threat, if you're not with me, then, marching orders, but also this pivot to say that the enemy is not a foreign enemy, but it's the enemy from within, and that we should be training our military officers on the streets of America and using the American citizens and those people who live in and amongst us as they are the enemy.
Right.
We don't know what was on the minds of the military generals. There's been a lot of rhetoric and a few leaks about what people thought, but that shot of their faces, one guy had his head in his hands like this, kind of spoke volumes, didn't it? Because the moment you involve the military, things change. It's almost like you're into slightly different territory. It transcends politics. So how did you feel when you saw that speech and also the words of Hegseth on the stage too?
Well, it compounds the danger that I've been talking about on the Oath in the Office, which is that he really is in the same way that the unitary executive, there's a parallel that there are ways of using destroying the supposed checks on the presidency, for instance, the for-cause requirement that limits him from firing the Fed governors or from firing a member of the Federal Trade Commission. The unitary executive theory is a constitutional theory above all of that they're trying to use to eviscerate. Now, that's eviscerating one of the core checks of government, that legislation is enforced by civil servants or independent agencies protected from political firing. And yet what he wants to do, just to put it in the most blunt terms, is political firing. Now, when it comes to the military, there is a law called the Posse Comitatus Act, And it's got a not proud history, actually. It was a way of limiting Grant's enforcement of civil rights in states that were resisting him. So it's a bad origin, but in some ways at this moment, it's the best we have. And it limits the use of the military domestically. Now, what's happening? There are all sorts of exceptions to that, including the Insurrection Act, which is an exception to posse comitatus. And so using the Insurrection Act, Trump is getting ready to do that. He's looking to provoke a fight in Portland so that he can then use it. And then what this was meant to be was a rallying of the generals to get them ready to go after the enemy from within. Now that is not only anti-democratic, it's fascist language. It's the language of Carl Schmitt, of the friend and enemy. And that's frightening, very frightening. I mean, have we ever seen, this kind of level of conflict before? Of course we have. In the Civil War, for instance, we saw it. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, the period that I'm talking about, the sides, the parallels are oddly inversed in some ways, because it was Grant using the military to enforce civil rights and states trying to resist in favor of white supremacy. But that kind of conflict has been with us. It is extremely dangerous. And as I said, we could have teetered, we could have been destroyed before, and it well could destroy us now. But it's not over. I think even though he's on that borderline into whether we'll call it a dictator, it's up to us. And we can fight back. By the way, we did fight back during the last term, and we did prevail. And it was partly civil servants, but it also was citizens demanding that this president not be that he be held to account. But
those civil servants have all been fired. I mean, this is what's changed.
That's right.
Is that the protections from within as well as outside have gone. Right. Can you tell me anything about this figure that gets banded around, that it only takes 3.5% of the population to overthrow a government? Because this is very positive if it is the case.
Yeah.
How does that work? Because my fear is that this is an assault on all levels. Trump has the Supreme Court in his pocket. I disagree with you slightly about them. I think they're very performative. I think they'll give you one, and then you'll think, lull you into a false sense of security. But they've done that on purpose because they know what's coming down the pike. And I'm sure that we're going to see the reversal of gay marriage and potentially interracial marriage and goodness knows what else. So he's got that. He's clearly got the Republicans in Congress, and that is a done deal. He has the executive. He's not even bothering to put anything to a vote anymore. So Congress are barely in session, and this is problematic. He is now going for the military. So what is the opportunity for the people? Because if he's also going after the vote, and this is widely documented now, that the voter suppression, it might even mean putting the National Guard at polling places and intimidating people. Yeah. Is it the vote that is the last bastion of democracy, or is there something else that 3.5% can make use of to bring down a fascist regime? Yeah, in my examples, it really is elections. The election of 1800, another election which really calls to mind what you were talking about, pivotal, the election of Ulysses Grant in 1868, done at gunpoint. Thousands of Black Americans were killed and risked their lives to go to the poll to elect Grant. And when he was elected, that it is why it was such a powerful recovery. He knew that. And he devoted his first term to these enforcement acts, to the creation of the Department of Justice as civil rights enforcement. That's why you needed posse comitatus. That was an act of resisting that kind of success later on. Yes, we've seen these before. I'll say too, there is a way into the hope too, that in your statistic, because these movements don't start as mass movements. They start as very, very small. The newspaper editors fighting back. I looked at Frederick Douglass's paper and the North Star, the name of his two publications. How many readers did he have? It was in the thousands. So, The Oath in the Office and Midas, we have way more people watching us and listening than Frederick Douglass did, not comparable. So, these small groups were able to galvanize, and then, yes, it is elections, make a difference in these elections and elect recovery presidents eventually. I mean, we don't have a no confidence vote, unlike parliamentary systems. That would be a way to, handle this, but we don't. And so we are stuck with a period of time of
of, yes, possibly even dictatorship as we wait. But I think, too, as I talk to people, you think of the example, even the worst examples of Chile, for instance. There is a no campaign. There is an end to the Pinochet regime. We're not anywhere, I think, close to that, I should say. But even in those frightening examples, it's not over. And these examples do parallel the past ones in which we've prevailed. The sad thing is, as a result of the destruction of the civil service, I do think courts, by the way, have a role. I've been working with the ACLU. We've had the ACLU policy director, Mike Zamor, on the oath in the office often. And that matters, the litigation that they're doing. And they are, of all the groups to support, certainly one of them. Because although you're right about the Supreme Court, those lower court opinions, the pushback, the genuine resistance that you get, for instance, from Justice Breyer's brother in the LA case, saying posse comitatus and the structure of the Constitution prohibit the use of the military domestically, that matters not just in slowing things down, not just in announcing a principle, but in galvanizing people. As we hear that, we're reminded of our democratic rights. So it all works together. Ultimately,
and we just got our free speech back with Judge Young, a federal judge there, right, who basically said that immigrants have the same free speech rights as citizens. That's really important.
Absolutely. And I mean, here's speaking of how relevant the book has turned out to be. As you said, it won the American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award. I like to think just because it's a great book. No, it's because the moment calls for a book like this. And just to show you how relevant the law that they're relying on in these Venezuelan deportations, to say that they can send people to a gulag in El Salvador or in various other countries to be tortured. The reason why there are no rights, no due process rights, is because although the Sedition Act expired and something called the Alien Friends Act expired, one of those laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts passed together, remains on the books. And that's the Alien Enemies Act, which revoked for members of so-called enemy nations basic rights of due process. And that's what the government is using in some of these cases to not only say you have no free speech rights, they're saying that too in the Khalil case and others, but to just deny any right to even appear in court. They're using this Adams era legacy. It shows you how we have been here before, and yet we defeated Adams, and I think we'll defeat this abuse of trying to bring back that dark period of American history.
I want to talk about something just on a bit of a tangent, and I think this came off the back of Trump's random speech in front of the military generals, where he was talking about Barack Obama's walk downstairs and stuff that they had traveled thousands of miles to come and listen to. But people are talking about the 25th Amendment again now, for the first time in a while. I don't know why that really went away, but there it is. The insanity of Donald Trump, not dissimilar to the madness of King George in many ways, but the insanity of Donald Trump is also problematic here, because we are not dealing with a sane person, clearly. And, the psychiatrists and the psychologists, they've all come together and they've diagnosed him with a personality disorder and malignant narcissism and everything that goes with that. This makes him extremely dangerous because the rules of engagement don't apply to him, not least the protocols of politics. So where in our history have we seen this before with somebody who is so mentally compromised that in a way has been the secret of their success, because they have no empathy. They don't feel any sense of shame, and that despite being a convicted felon and a sexual abuser, they're able just to kind of push on and control the storyline.
Yeah, I'll say first of all, before I get into your great question, that the 25th Amendment, in the first term we heard a lot about it, we're starting to hear about it again. And as much as I'm optimistic and hopeful about the long-term recovery, and I've talked about why, I'm also very blunt about stuff that's not going to work. And so, the 25th Amendment is, unfortunately, I wish this was not the case, but ineffectual. It requires all sorts of cooperation from the cabinet, the vice president, J.D. Vance. It's never going to happen. J.D. Vance is such a sycophant, so craven in his sucking up to Donald Trump. He will never stop things. Unless, he was 100% sure he was going to get rid of this guy and be then he would do it. But I don't see that happening. And what's so ill-designed about it is that it takes the president's closest allies and then asks them to remove him. It's just not going to happen. Then you need cooperation eventually from Congress, and this Congress won't do it. You would sooner get an impeachment and removal. We're not going to get that with this Congress. We might with the next. That is one thing that I should say there too, as much as I want to be optimistic, and I was a huge proponent of the 2 impeachments, and would be in a new Congress if the Democrats take the House for doing it, but not for the reason that people think. It's never worked before. The 2/3 requirement, like the 25th Amendment, is so burdensome. We're not going to get the votes likely. But what happened in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in the 19th century is a nice illustration of how you can tee it up. And he's certainly not going to resign like Nixon. He sees that as, what was wrong with this guy. But you tee it up, and Johnson didn't even get the nomination of his own party. The impeachment sting was so bad. And I think that is partly the story. The impeachments helped to set that election against Joe Biden and to help bring the victory and to get Americans, not all, but many Americans, to see that Trump really was a walking threat to democracy. Now I've lost the thread of your question, but
it was the mental health question. But I have another question now.
But you were asking too about history and the way that
have we had anyone as nuts as Trump? I mean, that's basically the question.
Definitely. Andrew Johnson, when you look in the speeches, they are wild and nuts. The guy is, and I think this goes beyond Trump. He is talking about his opponents in the Reconstruction Congress. He's trying to bring slavery back under a different name. They're trying to end slavery and the vestiges of slavery, to create an end to subordination. And he's essentially threatening violence against them in these speeches that he's giving around the country. When you read them, and one of the articles of impeachment was about the incitement of violence, basically, against members of Congress. So yes, that was a kind of wildness. And that is different, I should say, from John Adams and Wilson, who are more learned. But yeah, Johnson, he compares himself to Moses at some point, as I talk about. Douglas thinks that you can reason, Frederick Douglass, you can reason with him. And this guy's, thinking about himself as Moses for Black Americans. Right. And that's why he has to bring slavery back under a different name. So yes, that is a crazy man. The stories of Nixon and the erraticness, when you listen to him on the tapes, as I did, and he's told, for instance, that I told you I interviewed Ellsberg at length. Well, he's the target for so many of these crimes. He's talking to Kissinger, and he says, look, he thinks that Ellsberg has a second set of Pentagon papers. The Pentagon papers about the failed history of the war during Johnson weren't about Nixon. But he thought there was a second set and that there was evidence. And actually, Ellsberg told me he did have it. It just was in a different location than Nixon thought. But the papers Nixon was convinced would show that he had committed treason by negotiating with the Viet Cong to postpone the war until they could get a better deal when he was elected. He did not want them to come out. So now this is not conjecture. You can all hear this on the tapes themselves. They're on the internet. Kissinger and they're talking about it, and he's saying, I need what's in that safe. He thinks they're in a safe in the Brookings Institution. And Kissinger says, well, Mr. President, if they're in that safe, they shouldn't have those materials. Let's go to court and get, a good person, Henry Kissinger. And you're in trouble when the person defending the rule of law, by the way, in your administration is Henry Kissinger. And Nixon
a recipient of a Nobel Prize, right?
Yeah, unbelievable. And that Kissinger said, Nixon says back, no, Henry, I want it done on this is a word he uses, thievery basis. He's ordering a crime on the tapes. And then the stories of him, that the Secretary of Defense was so worried about his drinking that he gave an order to his staff that if there was a nuclear launch from the President of the United States, he was likely drunk, and to call him to confirm. That is a kind of coup, actually. There's nothing in the chain of command that says you can do that. These two examples are, right. They're very different than the Wilson and Adams, but they're frighteningly wacky would be an understatement.
And now we worry about the Secretary of Defense's own drinking. So, right. how things change.
Now we've replaced the president's drinking with an alcoholic Secretary of Defense, and likely my former student. Sorry about that.
So we speak of Kissinger getting his Nobel Peace Prize. Trump is desperate for this, and partly because Barack Obama got one, and he can't live with the fact that a person of color can get one in the same job. It kills him as a white supremacist, I'm sure. As I was educating myself about the latest plans for Gaza and Trump's kind of plan to bring peace to the Middle East, which is, of course, full of holes. And, the Abraham Accords are very performative and don't really have any substance. But I thought for a moment, hang on a second, like, they're going to give him the Nobel Peace Prize, partly just to shut him up, but partly because this is the only reason he's doing this. He doesn't care for the Palestinians, or he doesn't care for anybody, clearly, but I mean, there's no empathy there. Yeah. This is all about what he can get. And I fear that part of this agreement, part of this arrangement, I mean, I know that Netanyahu's already nominated him for one, but it is that, they might even invent a new prize with a similar name just to, give him that crowning moment, because he wants to have that legacy.
Well, it's such a frightening thought, because it is that kind of rewriting of history then that we talked about with Wilson, taking a moment of the end of the beyond evil institution of enslavement and turning that into, the story of reconstruction, of triumph over that institution, of the anti-subordination movement, of the radical Republicans in Congress, the election for the first time of black members to state houses and the U.S. Congress, and rewriting that into the opposite of a horrible thing, and the Klan, the evil movement of the time, into the heroes. If the world starts to recognize Trump as anything but what he is, which is an opponent of not just liberal democracy and constitutional law and the rule of law, but decency. That gets scary, and history is really being rewritten. And yes, I think that starts risking that as hopeful as I've tried to be, that we're teetering into a different direction. And if there is a recovery, and I still would be hopeful, even if that happens, that it's not going to be 3 years. It could be decades. And as I mentioned the Pinochet example, I don't want to be cavalier about that. That was like over a decade that it took to recover. And we've had over a decade of Orban, even though we might recover from him.
But we've already had a decade of Trump. I mean, people forget that he didn't stop campaigning and lying during the 4 years of Biden's presidency.
Yeah.
And now, to all intents and purposes, 2028, he has his eyes set on it, not least because he's already produced the merchandise for it. Yeah. I mean, this is very serious. He will find a reason to say, the election was taken from me, I was exiled to Mar-a-Lago, I deserve to get that term as I should have done, and he will make that happen. I am sure of it. And I think people are starting to talk about it in those terms now, too.
We did, I would say it hasn't been continuous. We did stop him. What makes him very different, I should say, as much as I've been emphasizing the parallels from past presidents, and I said this in an interview with Thomas Edsall for the New York Times, is that he came back. And then all those examples that I've told you about, once they lost, they lost. That was it. Nixon, moved to California and then Saddle River. He was on CNN and did interviews, but he wasn't back in politics. Johnson doesn't get the nomination of his own party. Wilson dies. Adams disappears from public life, and so does Buchanan. This guy
Trump was barred from Twitter and barred from YouTube.
Yeah,
but YouTube just paid him $22 million as an apology for that.
Yeah, I mean, I should say too, we almost could have defeated him, and the failure to indict him, I think, was the great tragedy of American history. And it parallels. I wish the book was less relevant, but the book talks about the failure to indict Nixon as the reason why we never really were able to recover from Nixon, because the reason why you don't know about the attempt to kill Daniel Ellsberg on the Capitol steps, the attempted break-in and blowing up, as they planned, of the Brookings Institution and the thievery basis way of getting into the safe, the more known, but not as much as it should be, break-in at the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg, the hard hat riot, which was being investigated by a prosecutor called Ackerman, that Nixon had ordered it and sparked it, the beating of students in New York after the tragedy at Kent State, is because we never had a trial. We never allowed those cases that were being made against him. Even the tapes case itself, the tapes were part of a sort of fraud scheme that they were looking into. There would have been countless trials, and we would have seen how dangerous this office is if it gets in the hand of not just a bad, but a criminal president. And the pardon for all the kumbaya, oh, it's about moving the country forward, did the opposite. It made us totally unaware of the danger of criminality in the White House. And I think that contributed to Mueller's failure and the failure of Smith and really of the Biden administration. And for all his virtues, Joe Biden was not a recovery president. He didn't put things back the way that Jefferson and Madison did, reigniting the idea of the right to dissent, even during the War of 1812, or that I mentioned Grant and the Enforcement Acts and the creation of the Department of Justice, really giving teeth to civil rights, or the story of Sadie Alexander and Truman, desegregating the federal government, desegregating the military, creating the framework that became the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Those were real recoveries from the crisis that I'm talking about.
But why didn't Biden?
And Biden didn't do it.
Why?
Well, it was a real failure. I was part of several, voice in the wilderness, but I certainly was talking about the need at that time for a recovery, and I had the chance sometimes to be somewhat close or give a talk to members of his inner circle.
So what were the options for him?
Arguments were, you don't know how bad Ken Starr was. You don't know what it was like to create real mechanisms, including the independent counsel, that are capable of prosecuting a president. That's what I was calling for, a new independent counsel that could indict a president. We had it before, we could bring it back. We could tweak it, but we know how to do it. We know how to hold presidents to account. But the worry, I think, of the Biden people was that, Ken Starr was so bad. They're so obsessed with that moment. Government won't be able to function. Well, we're not going to have a democracy if you don't prosecute a president, if you don't put these mechanisms in place, and you don't prepare for the next criminal president. Fine. Biden is a good, decent person. That's not how you think about it. They were thinking about, this is an unfortunate and chilling reality. They were thinking about Biden as the president in the way the framers themselves were thinking about George Washington. Designing a system around a decent person. I have no doubt Biden is decent, and that George Washington was a person who believed in the law, despite his many flaws. But that's not how you design a system. You design it to protect against the danger, the threat to democracy, and the walking danger of democracy that was Donald Trump was right before us.
Well, they'd already been
on January 6th.
I was going to say, January 6th had already happened, so it wasn't like this was something off in the distance, this could happen. And now we find ourselves in a place where Trump has pardoned and commuted the sentences of 99% of those involved in January 6th.
Yeah.
I mean,
the pardon, I also, talk a lot on The Oath in the Office, and have written, in particular, with a presidential scholar named Jeff Toulis, about the pardon power. The framers called it the benign power of prerogative. Yeah, in the hands of a good president. Right. But in the hands of a criminal president, it's a way of pardoning co-conspirators, another thing that the Anti-Federalists were so aware of. And, we needed pardon reform so desperately to say that legislation to say a president can't pardon close cronies or family members. And, we could discuss the details of the Hunter Biden pardon, but that doesn't help things when the president pardons his son. That's exactly the way the pardon is not supposed to work.
Well, then they weaponize the hypocrisy, don't they? And
they sure do. And he opened us up to that.
Becomes an issue all of its own. Yes. We have to finish in a minute, but finally, I want to ask you, I mean, dictatorships always fall, right? And is that the rule? Because, it's something that needs to be tested in this moment. Currently, we're in the midst of a government shutdown. Trump is weaponizing the shutdown. My opinion is that he needs the shutdown. He wants the shutdown because the economy is faltering. The tariffs are not doing what he had hoped. And in the same way that when COVID came, he was able to claim that he had the greatest economy and then COVID killed it, here he can claim that he has the greatest economy and the Democrats killed it with their shutdown. This is a very useful opportunity to have an excuse for his disastrous policies. So how does this end is my question. It's a huge prediction to have you make, but we mentioned that this could last 3 years or it could last a decade or more. Which side of the fence are you falling on this?
Well, there's in sort of political science, there's a lot of people who do predictions. I've been really careful to try to use this language of hope because I want to emphasize agency. And there is a path to recovery. I have no doubt about that. And it involves the midterms and the next presidential election. And again, even if there is intimidation at the polls, we've seen that often actually before in American history, and we can prevail against it. It took a lot to do it, massive courage, which is why Grant was so beholden to that constituency that risked its life. Black Americans elected Grant, 1868.
And the rampant gerrymandering as well.
Yes, well, that's right. And gerrymandering is not new. Right. It goes way back. So these problems have been with us. Now, what will make the difference is really not Trump. It's us. Whether or not we do come together, whether or not we have a common message, a common vocabulary, and a clear-headed desire to save democracy. And, we began that. I hoped that we began that process in defeating Trump, despite January 6th. That was not the moment. But two things need to happen. It's not, I should emphasize too, and our discussion about Biden's term, I think, brings it out. It isn't enough to defeat him at the polls. To defeat MAGA, to defeat all of this, we need to restructure the American government in a way that reaffirms the idea of the rule of law, that we don't prosecute political opponents as we are with Comey, that we don't shut down free speech by non-citizens who, by the way, the Constitution says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say anything about citizens. That we have a renewed focus on equal protection. Those pillars of democracy, as I talk about them in the book, and each week on The Oath in the Office, the right to dissent, the idea of equal protection under law, and the rule of law, not men, those ideas have to be re-enshrined in legislation. And so defeating him is part of it, but it's the agenda of recovery. That's really what will make the difference, or not. Without it, I'm pessimistic, but with it, very hopeful.
I'll hold you to that in the nicest possible way. Corey Brettschneider, thanks for joining the Weekend Show.
What a pleasure. I'm a huge fan, as you know, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.